Welcome to Section 2, Part 2. In this second video, we will discuss each spinal tract. So let's get started. So the spinal tracts include the dorsal column, the spinothalamic tract, and the corticospinal tract. And oftentimes the dorsal column is referred to as the DCML, or the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. So let's first start with the dorsal column. The dorsal column carries vibration and proprioception to the brain. It travels up the posterior or dorsal part of the spinal cord, hence the name dorsal column, and it'll travel through either the fasciculus gracilis, which is for the lower extremities, or the fasciculus cuneatus for the upper extremities. Now the first synapse occurs in the ipsilateral medulla on the nucleus cuneatus or gracilis, depending on whether or not it traveled using the fasciculus cuneatus or the fasciculus gracilis. And we'll show that in a moment. The neuron, once it reaches the medulla, will then decussate, so it'll cross to the contralateral side and then travel through the medial lemniscus pathway, which is where we get the ML in DCML. And then it just continues upward. Then there is a second synapse between the second and third neurons in this pathway, and that occurs in the VPL, or ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Then the tract continues to the primary somatosensory cortex. So let's draw this out. So this is figure 8.13 from your text, which outlines the pathway for the dorsal column. As we mentioned before, sensation comes in through the dorsal root and into the spinal cord. The dorsal column is specifically responsible for vibration and proprioception, as labeled here. Proprioception tells your brain where your body parts are at all times. And once in the spinal cord, the tract will continue up the dorsal column. So as you can see on this image, the dorsal column is divided based on different parts of the body. So it can be the fasciculus gracilis or the fasciculus cuneatus. The gracilis being the inner portion and the cuneatus being the outer portion. If sensation is coming from the lower extremity, it'll travel up the dorsal column through the fasciculus gracilis, and if it's coming from the upper extremity, it'll travel through the dorsal column using the fasciculus cuneatus. So now I'm just going to erase this so we can focus on just the tract. So the tract then continues up along the ipsilateral side until it reaches the medulla. Notice how there has not been any synapsing up to this point. It has just been one single axon from way down here, where the sensation came from, to all the way up here, to our first synapse. Then we have the synapse in the medulla, the ipsilateral side. There's a nucleus gracilis or nucleus cuneatus, and what nucleus the nerve will synapse to depends entirely upon which pathway it used, the fasciculus gracilis or cuneatus. From here, this second neuron decussates within the medulla and travels up using the medial lemniscus. And the only thing you need to know about the medial lemniscus is that it's the latter portion of the DCML, and it's just this pathway. So think of it as the pathway from the medulla to the thalamus, so essentially the second neuron. So we're using the medial lemniscus, and this neuron goes until it reaches the thalamus, and again it synapses onto the ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. So then this third neuron now travels up until it reaches the primary sensory cortex. And this is discussed in section 1 of this chapter. So to summarize figure 8.13 from your text, sensation travels through an axon that enters the dorsal root, travels up the dorsal column and synapses onto a nucleus within the medulla, then crosses to the medial lemniscus. It then goes up to the VPL in the thalamus, where the second synapse occurs. Then the third neuron carries information to the somatosensory cortex. So if a patient has a damaged dorsal column, like right here, then they are not going to be able to sense vibration and proprioception below that level on the ipsilateral side, so staying on this side. But if damage occurs up here, following the decussation, then of course the patient would have contralateral loss of vibration and proprioception. So some pearls to keep in the back of your mind is that two major causes of dorsal column damage So the DC part of the DCML is B12 deficiency and tertiary syphilis. So dorsal column damage is anything prior to the decussation before the medial lemniscus pathway. So anything in this side. So this would be considered the dorsal column aspect. So you would get ipsilateral signs with damage to the dorsal column. So now let's dive a little deeper with a question. So a male patient has damaged the left dorsal column at the L1 spinal cord level. What will be his symptoms and where will he experience them? Okay, so this is the patient's left and this is the patient's right. And so he's damaged the dorsal column on the left side. So this side over here. And we know that the dorsal column carries vibration and proprioception. So we know that if this patient has damaged the left part of the dorsal column, he will lack vibration and proprioception. The only question that remains is where will he experience them? So let's quickly review the pathway of the dorsal column by looking at a diagram of the man as well. So again, the man has damaged the left part of the dorsal column at the L1 spinal cord level. And recall, by looking at the L1 spinal cord level on the man, that sensation comes in through the dorsal root ganglion, travels up the dorsal column, all the way up until the tract reaches the medulla, and then it synapses, and then there's a decussation that travels up to the VPL of the thalamus, and then to the somatosensory cortex. So we'll just write cortex. So in this man, this portion is damaged. This means that any signals that try to use the dorsal column below the L1 spinal cord level is stopped. So as you can see, if sensation is trying to come up through his big toe, it'll stop once it reaches this L1 spinal cord level. Even if it goes to the S2 and then travels up, it'll stop. So vibration and proprioception below the L1 spinal cord level will be damaged on the ipsilateral side. So let's do another question. What symptoms would a patient experience if only the lateral portion of the right dorsal column was damaged at the C4 spinal cord level? So in this question, we need to make sure we recognize that the dorsal column carries the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis. So we know that this side is the patient's right, and this side is the patient's left, and this is the C4 spinal cord level. And that makes sense because this image looks like a cervical spinal cord level based on its unique shape, which we discussed in part 1 of this section. So if the right lateral portion of the dorsal column is damaged, we'll fill in this damaged area here. As we discussed on the previous slide, anything below this lesion on the ipsilateral side will experience loss of vibration and proprioception. However, if the medial portion was spared, as in this case, that means that some tracts are fully functional. So as I've written here, with a G, the fasciculus gracilis is spared on both sides of this patient. So this patient has damaged the fasciculus cuneatus, as we just mentioned, but it's helpful to look at the image of the man as well, because we can easily remember that the fasciculus cuneatus on either side is responsible for carrying information to the upper limbs, because they are on the outside. However, the fasciculus gracilis is on the inner portion, the medial portion of the dorsal column, which is responsible for carrying information to the legs on the inside. So the arms are far out laterally, and so the lateral portion of the dorsal column, the fasciculus cuneatus, is in the lateral portion as well. So feet in, arms out. So going back to the question, a patient who has damaged the lateral portion of the right dorsal column, so right here, at the C4 spinal cord level, would lose vibration and proprioception of the arm, but not the leg. So we will write the right upper extremity experiences loss of vibration and proprioception, but the right lower extremity is spared. So now we just need to talk about the Romberg test really quick. Now this is very important as it relates to the dorsal column. It's really high yield for examination purposes. So it's used to determine the cause of ataxia. It really helps to distinguish between dorsal column damage and cerebellar ataxia. Now just recall that ataxia means gait abnormality. So a patient's walking funny and you want to know if it's the cerebellum that's the problem or if the dorsal column is the problem. So to understand the Romberg test, it's important to recognize that a patient requires 2 of the 3 following things in order to stand and have normal gait. They need proprioception. In other words, they need the dorsal column, medial lemniscus pathway fully intact. They need vision. They need to be able to see where they are. And they need vestibular function, which helps them balance. And if they lose one of those, let's say proprioception, then when they're walking around, they have vision and vestibular function, which means that they can walk totally normal because they have 2 of the 3. However, if you ask them to close their eyes, which is what the Romberg test is, you ask them to close their eyes while standing still, then they have essentially lost their vision, which means they only have 1 of the 3. And this means that this patient will lose balance. And if this happens, then you know, okay, they have obviously damaged the dorsal column because they have a positive Romberg's test. Now let's talk about the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract carries pain and temperature sensation from the periphery to the brain. The first synapse occurs in the ipsilateral gray matter of the posterior horn. So this synapse occurs in the actual spinal cord, not the medulla in the brainstem like the dorsal column did. So this first synapse occurs much earlier in the pathway. The neuron then decussates through the anterior white commissure until it reaches the lateral white matter on the contralateral side, and then it continues upward from there. And then it goes straight through the medulla until finally it reaches the thalamus, and the second synapse occurs on the VPL, just like in the dorsal column, and then the tract continues to the primary somatosensory cortex, just like in the dorsal column. So let's draw this out. So this is figure 8.14 from your text. Pain and temperature sensation enter through the dorsal root. Again, the cell body for this first neuron lies within the dorsal root, hence the name dorsal root ganglion. And the first neuron then enters the posterior horn of the gray matter. And again, the gray matter is this dark blue, and the synapse occurs right here in the posterior horn. Then the second neuron then crosses to the contralateral side using this anterior white commissure. So the nerve then finally reaches the contralateral side at the anterior lateral white matter. It's the term anterolateral system, which is a synonym for the spinothalamic tract. And then the tract just travels straight up, no more decussation. It goes straight up to the thalamus, synapses onto the VPL, and then finally enters the primary somatosensory cortex. So something that's really important for distinguishing the spinothalamic tract from the dorsal column pathway is that the decussation happens early in the spinal cord. Like as soon as the pain and temperature come in, there's a decussation. Whereas in the dorsal column, the decussation happens up here in the medulla. So now let's do a question. So a patient is involved in a serious car accident and has lost pain and temperature sensation of the right lower extremity. Where is the lesion likely to be on the spinal cord? Okay, so the patient has lost pain and temperature sensation of the right lower extremity. So their right leg. The spinal cord region responsible for the leg is primarily lumbar, so I will just write a capital L here in the lumbar region. We discuss dermatomes in greater detail later in this chapter. For now, just recognize that this patient has lost pain and temperature for the entire leg, and we suspect that the lumbar region is responsible for that. So now we want to know exactly where on the spinal cord the patient has damage. The spinal thalamic tract comes in, this right side. There's a synapse immediately, and the second neuron then crosses the anterior white commissure, travels all the way up until it reaches the VPL, and then finally to the somatosensory cortex. I will just write cortex. So let's say as a clinician you get more information and you receive the results of the X-ray and you find that the L2 spinal cord is specifically damaged. Now if you damage the posterior horn of the gray matter right here, then you would definitely interrupt the spinal thalamic tract at the L2 level, because the nerve would come up, and the first neuron would synapse here in the posterior gray horn, and then the second neuron would then travel over and then travel up. So pain and temperature sensation would definitely be lost at the L2 spinal cord level. However, anything above L2, for example L1, would be just fine, because it can come in, synapse onto the gray matter, and decussate and travel up, and anything below, like L3, can do the same thing. To illustrate this, let's add in every level from L1 to S1, and as you can see, they're labeled here. So as you can see, if damage to the posterior horn of L2, right here in the gray matter, if that was damaged, that would leave signals from L1 up and L3 down unaffected. As we can see, the nerve will come in, synapse, and come up just fine. This is the same for every single level from L3 down to S1. Whereas the L2 spinal cord level would just be damaged, and you'd lose signal at that specific level. And if this were the case, then this patient would only have loss of pain and temperature sensation at the L2 dermatome, which would look something like that. This patient, however, has the entire leg with loss of pain and temperature. So it would not make sense that damage to the posterior horn of the gray matter is the culprit of his findings. So we'll erase this. So we no longer suspect the posterior horn of the gray matter. So what else could have caused a loss of pain and temperature sensation in the entire lower right extremity? So another possibility is that the anterolateral portion of the white matter is damaged at the L2 spinal cord level. So in other words, right here in this region, that means the nerve would come in, synapse here in the posterior horn of the gray matter, decussate, and try to travel up, but it can't. It stopped because of the damage in the white matter. So this would mean that every level of the spinal cord from L2 and down would actually be unable to get their signals up. So if the anterior white matter was damaged, then these nerves would not be able to carry their signal out to the brain. So the patient would lose all sensation from L2 and down, which would explain why this patient has lost all of the right lower extremity, pain and temperature. So going back to our question, with total loss of pain and temperature from the right lower extremity, we expect that there was damage to the anterolateral white matter. Now let's do another question. Let's say a patient has damaged the anterior white commissure of the T1 spinal cord. What symptoms would you expect? So recall that the anterior white commissure is right there, and it's used by the spinal thalamic tract. Recall that as the signal enters, synapses in the posterior horn, then decussates in this white matter here, and then travels up. Same thing with the other side. Synapses here in the posterior horn, uses the anterior white commissure, and then travels up. So if the patient has damaged the anterior white commissure of the T1 spinal cord right here, then the patient would lose pain and temp sensation coming in from either side. But this would be at just the T1 spinal cord level, because as you recall, if this part is spared, then everything coming above T1 and anything coming from below T1 would be able to carry its signal just fine up to the brain, because the pathway is totally fine. as we've described in the previous section. So the patient would only lose pain and temperature at the T1 spinal cord level. A disease that classically causes these findings is called syringomyelia, and this occurs when a syrinx, a fluid-filled cavity, develops in this portion of the spinal cord that we've just talked about, often in the C8 to T1 distribution. So this patient demonstrates that classic syringomyelia of loss of pain and temperature just in the T1 dermatome. So now let's talk about the corticospinal tract. Now the corticospinal tract carries motor input from the brain to the body. Now the first neuron originates in the primary motor cortex. Then it travels through the internal capsule and the medulla. At the level of the medulla, the corticospinal tract then decussates, specifically at the medullary pyramids, and then the contralateral tract then continues down within the posterolateral white matter until the axon actually reaches the appropriate level. And then at that point, it enters the anterior horn of the gray matter within the spinal cord. And this is where the first synapse occurs. It actually occurs here in the anterior horn, and then the second neuron exits the spinal cord through the anterior root. Unlike the ascending tracts, such as the dorsal column and the spinothalamic tract, which came in through the dorsal root, the corticospinal tract exits through the anterior root. And then the second neuron then synapses at the neuromuscular junction. So let's draw this out. So this is figure 8.15 from your text, and up here is the cerebral cortex, specifically the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe. The neuron originates here and then descends through the internal capsule, then reaches the medulla, and then decussates at the medullary pyramids, as labeled here, the medullary pyramidal decussation. The tract then continues within the white matter until it reaches the appropriate level. So as you can see, this is a cervical spinal cord, and for this particular neuron, it'll come down, stay within the white matter until it reaches the level that it needs to send its neuron out, and at that point it'll cross over into this anterior horn of the gray matter. And then finally, the second neuron then leaves through the anterior root and then goes to the neuromuscular junction, where it performs its action. So notice how the signal originated in the cortex at this portion of the brain, indicating it would be the upper limb. However, if the signal originated from this portion right here of the cortex and then traveled down, we would think that this would be the lower limb. And this is where it's really important to be familiar with the homunculus, which is figure 8.6. So for more information on the homunculus, please visit section 1 of this chapter. So now let's talk about upper and lower motor neurons. The upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron refer to the two neurons that make up the corticospinal tract that we just discussed. So this first one in red would be the upper motor neuron. This lower one in blue would be the lower motor neuron. Now, upper motor neuron lesions damage that first neuron, as mentioned. So signs of upper motor neuron damage would be the Babinski reflex. And this is where the bottom of the foot is stroked and the patient's big toe ends up pointing up, as in upper motor neuron. Now, the Babinski reflex is normal in infants, but it's not normal in adults. The patient's feet should squeeze down and toes point down. So if you get the Babinski reflex in an adult, you're thinking about upper motor neuron damage. Another symptom is spastic paralysis and clasp knife spasticity. Another important gem is to remember that upper motor neuron damage increases. It increases tone and reflexes, whereas lower motor neuron damage decreases. It decreases tone and reflexes. Another sign of lower motor neuron damage is atrophy and fasciculations. Fasciculations are just muscle spasms. They're pretty strong in these patients. They're not like typical muscle spasms, but that's a safe way to think about them. So now let's look at figure 8.15 from your text. This first neuron is the upper motor neuron, and the second neuron is the lower motor neuron. And if we damage this first neuron, we would get the Babinski reflex and increased tone and reflexes. The patient could also demonstrate clasp knife spasticity and spastic paralysis. Now, if we damage the lower motor neuron, we would get signs of lower motor neuron damage. So we would get decreased tone and reflexes, fasciculations, and atrophy. In either situation, whether damaging the upper motor neuron or the lower motor neuron, the patient would demonstrate weakness because the signal from the brain to the neuromuscular junction is damaged. So the patient would just be weak at that level. So now let's do a question. A patient has hydrocephalus. What would you expect to have happen to the deep tendon reflexes? Now, hydrocephalus doesn't always cause alterations of deep tendon reflexes, but when it does, what do you expect? Well, a hydrocephalus would definitely affect the upper motor neuron, not the lower motor neuron. So recall the symptoms for upper motor neuron lesions are increased tone and reflexes, the toes point up, so positive Babinski, and spastic paralysis. And of course, clasp knife spasticity as well. But the point is that if we damage the upper motor neuron with a hydrocephalus, then there would be increased tone and reflexes, so the deep tendon reflexes would be increased. Let's do another question. Let's say an elderly male patient complains of being unable to move his right upper extremity. Upon examination, his right upper extremity is very stiff. Where could this lesion be? So what's being described in this scenario is spastic paralysis. So notice that his arm is paralyzed, he's unable to move his right upper extremity, and he's demonstrating stiffness or hypertonia. So we believe that he has spastic paralysis, which is a sign of an upper motor neuron lesion. Whenever you get an upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron question, think of the corticospinal tract. So let's take a look at that really quick. The patient demonstrates signs of an upper motor neuron lesion in the right upper extremity. So we know that the upper motor neuron that is affected originates in the left motor cortex. And we'll make sure we understand that it's in the appropriate part of the homunculus. Recall that the pathway, then the neuron travels down the internal capsule, and then it decussates at the medullary pyramids and descends in the white matter until it reaches the appropriate level, and then it enters the gray matter, the anterior horn, synapses, and then leaves through the anterior root to the neuromuscular junction. Damage could be anywhere along this pathway. So specifically, we're talking about the right upper extremity, which makes sense because this is a cervical spinal cord level. But this patient has spastic paralysis. So we know that it's an upper motor neuron. So this patient could have damage anywhere from here to here. So with the information given in the question, you cannot actually identify the exact location of the damage for the upper motor neuron. It could have happened prior to the decussation or after the decussation. However, if I now told you that the patient had an MCA stroke, then where would you identify the lesion? So you would then focus your attention on the brain, where strokes occur, and you would think that the lesion happened prior to the decussation. So you'd focus your attention simply on the MCA area or the motor cortex. Let's do another question. Let's say a 5-year-old unvaccinated infant who recently moved to the country has muscle fasciculations, and he has them in all 4 limbs. Where's the problem? Well, first identify the symptom as a lower motor neuron lesion, and recall that signs of lower motor neuron lesions include decreased tone and reflexes, fasciculations, and atrophy. So we believe that this patient has a lower motor neuron lesion. So since we have identified the lesion as being a lower motor neuron problem, we can focus our attention on just the spinal cord and ignore the brain. Recall that the lower motor neuron begins with the cell body in the anterior horn of the gray matter. So somewhere from here to the neuromuscular junction is damaged. But recognize that this is in all 4 limbs, so it's not just the spinal cord level. Since this patient is unvaccinated and from out of the country, poliomyelitis is a possibility. Poliomyelitis actually causes damage to the anterior horn cells. So poliomyelitis would explain the lower motor neuron signs in all 4 extremities, because we'd expect this to happen in more than just the cervical spinal cord, we'd expect it to happen in the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral levels. Poliomyelitis can affect all of these, which explains why the patient has damage to all 4 limbs and has these muscle fasciculations. However, in real-life situations, poliomyelitis is typically asymmetric. So whenever you see symptoms of lower motor neuron lesions, you should think of the anterior horn and below, as shown here. Now let's do a question to tie it all together. So let's say a patient has left-sided Brown-Séquard syndrome. This is at the T9 spinal cord level. What will be the symptoms? Okay, so here we have a cross-section of the T9 spinal cord, and this portion would be totally damaged. And that's what Brown-Séquard syndrome is. It's where it's a complete hemisection of one side of the spinal cord. And so this is the patient's left, hence left-sided Brown-Séquard syndrome. So let's think of all 3 tracts one by one. So first let's think of the dorsal column, which comes in, enters through the dorsal root ganglion, and then it doesn't synapse but just stays ipsilateral and goes up. So if the dorsal column is damaged, this portion right here, then everything below the T9 level would experience loss of vibration and proprioception. So if we draw T9 right here, then we would expect the patient would have lost vibration and proprioception everywhere on the ipsilateral side below the T9 spinal cord level. So we're at loss of vibration and proprioception. Now let's talk about the spinothalamic tract. Now this comes in, goes through the dorsal root ganglion, and it synapses in the posterior horn, and then decussates through the anterior white commissure, and then travels up to the thalamus. So everything above and below T9 on the left side will be able to travel up as normal. Now we demonstrated this earlier in the lecture, but just to reiterate, it could come in through a lower spinal cord level, decussate, and then travel up as normal, and the same thing for above the T9 level. So we will erase this for now, and we will demonstrate the loss of sensation on this man on the right. So everything above and below T9 on the left side will be able to travel up as normal. So there will be no deficit on this left side. So no pain and temperature loss on the left. Except at the T9 level, where we can clearly see the posterior horn is damaged from the Brown-Séquard syndrome. However, on the contralateral side, which uses this portion of the white matter, we'll lose the pain and temperature sensation. So we can demonstrate that the spinothalamic tract comes in, this first neuron, it synapses on the posterior horn, and it decussates this anterior white commissure, and then it tries to use this anterior lateral portion of the white matter. But this portion is damaged. That means that anything below T9 on the contralateral side will be unable to travel up. So I'm just demonstrating some lower spinal cord levels, and you can see they just get stopped because of the damage from this Brown-Séquard syndrome. So I'll demonstrate this on this man. So everything on this contralateral side will have lost pain and temperature. Now let's move on to the corticospinal tract. If the anterior horn of the gray matter is damaged, so this region here, then the patient would demonstrate lower motor neuron lesion signs on the ipsilateral side at the T9 level. So everything through here would demonstrate lower motor neuron signs because every axon traveling down on this ipsilateral side would not be able to synapse appropriately with the anterior horn. And actually, since this portion of the spinal cord is damaged as well, that means you're going to get upper motor neuron signs below this level. So this patient would actually demonstrate upper motor neuron signs below the T9 level as well. And that concludes this section.